The romantic Paris you know is a lie. It is a modern illusion built directly on top of a massive, deliberate graveyard of a 1,000-year-old medieval metropolis, erased by Napoleon III and Baron Haussmann in 1860 during the most ruthless, large-scale real estate flip in human history. You see postcards featuring the glowing iron of the Eiffel Tower, sweeping, wide avenues, and pristine outdoor cafes. But underneath that expensive pavement lies a ghost town. To truly understand this absolute systemic erasure, we must travel back to the desperate reality of the mid-19th century. The Second French Empire was facing a catastrophic existential crisis. Paris was not a shimmering city of light. It was a suffocating, sunless labyrinth of decay. Imagine stepping into streets so incredibly narrow, you could literally reach out your window and shake hands with a neighbor across the alleyway. There was no sunlight. There was no fresh air. The architectural canopy overhead was so dense that rain rarely reached the mud below, leaving the city in a perpetual, suffocating twilight. In central districts, like the ancient Ile de la Cité, population density reached a staggering 100,000 people per square kilometer. For context, that is more than double the density of modern-day Manhattan, crammed into decaying, precarious wooden structures built during the Dark Ages. This was not just uncomfortable, it was undeniably lethal. Because of this extreme overcrowding, waterborne diseases thrived in the darkness. Relentless sickness swept through the population with a terrifying, invisible efficiency, silently emptying entire city blocks in a matter of weeks. That is exactly why the government panicked. They realized that if the capital didn't breathe, the empire would soon suffocate entirely. Napoleon III looked at the rotting map of his capital and decided that surgical preservation was a fantasy. The only cure was absolute, total amputation. But this massive demolition wasn't just about cleaning up the streets. It was a calculated erasure hiding a much darker motive. If your hometown was suffocating in its own history, would you authorize the bulldozers to erase your ancestral home for the promise of a perfect future? Let me know below, because that's exactly the impossible choice they faced. And the man chosen to execute this impossible choice wouldn't just erase the past. He would weaponize the future, stepping out of the shadows with a map, a ruler, and absolute power. Part 2. The Man with the White X. They didn't call him an architect. They called him the Attila of the Straight Line. Baron Haussmann was not a man of subtle artistry or gentle preservation. He was a bureaucratic warlord, appointed directly by the emperor to execute a hostile, relentless takeover of his own nation's capital. This was not a benign public works project. It was a calculated military operation against geography itself. To achieve his terrifying vision, Haussmann required a weapon far more devastating than dynamite. He needed absolute, unquestionable legal supremacy over the population. That is where the terrifying power of eminent domain entered the equation. The state rapidly passed unprecedented expropriation laws. These new legal frameworks completely bypassed centuries of established property rights, aggressively stripping hundreds of thousands of native Parisians of any right to appeal. The psychological terror of this legal machine was absolute. Imagine waking up in the modest apartment your family had owned for 5 generations. You look out the window into the morning fog. A government official in a dark coat is quietly painting a stark, white X on your wooden front door. That X was not a suggestion or a warning. It was a definitive, absolute erasure for your personal history. It meant the unstoppable machine of the empire had officially marked your existence for deletion. There were no riots at first, only a chilling, heavy silence as reality set in across the neighborhoods. families were desperately packing fragile heirlooms, staring at the suddenly empty chairs in their living rooms, realizing these familiar walls would be reduced to dust by nightfall. You might assume the public fought back against these terrifying eviction notices, but the law contained a devastating loophole that made resistance mathematically impossible. Compensation was dictated purely by the state, offering mere fractions of actual value, forcing the displaced to accept pennies or face the absolute force of the state. Imagine finding that X on your front door tomorrow morning, with just 24 hours to leave forever. What is the one single item you would grab before the wrecking balls arrived? Drop your survival item in the comments. As the first iron pickaxes swung into ancient stone, the citizens believed they were sacrificing their homes for a beautiful new city, completely unaware that the actual blueprint was a trap designed to destroy them. Part 3. The Secret Blueprint for War. The wide, tree-lined boulevards tourists stroll down today weren't built for romantic walks. They were built for artillery fire. This is the ultimate uncomfortable truth hiding in plain sight within modern urban planning. When Haussmann stared at the chaotic labyrinth of old Paris, he didn't just see a desperate public health crisis. He saw a profound tactical nightmare for the French military. For decades, whenever the restless citizens of Paris rebelled, and they rebelled often, they would drag heavy furniture, iron carts, and loose cobblestones into the narrow, winding alleys to create impenetrable barricades. A few dozen armed citizens could easily lock out an entire battalion of the emperor's soldiers. That changes everything about how you look at the city map. Haussmann's famous architectural mandate was actually a brilliant, ruthless masterclass in counterinsurgency. He wasn't just connecting picturesque neighborhoods. He was drawing clear, unobstructed trajectories for heavy weaponry. The new grand avenues had to be perfectly straight. Why? Because you cannot fire artillery around a corner. The beautiful aesthetics were secondary to the military objective. Furthermore, the very ground beneath their feet was quietly weaponized. The old, loose cobblestones, which were perfect for building those makeshift rebel walls, were systematically replaced. Haussmann introduced smooth, seamless macadam paving. This early form of tarmac was practically impossible for rioters to tear up rapidly with hand tools. This strategic urbanism deliberately linked massive military barracks directly to vital, wide civilian squares. The breathtaking beauty of the endless limestone facades was merely elegant camouflage for a massive, military-grade lockdown system. This geometry of power wasn't kept secret. It was drawn in plain sight, quietly turning every major intersection into a heavily calibrated strategic focus point. To the untrained eye, the map looked like a triumph of enlightenment, bringing light and order to the darkness. But to the generals of the Second Empire, it was a beautifully paved mousetrap, ensuring the working class could never successfully revolt again. With the trap fully designed on paper, Haussmann unleashed a mechanical plague of 100,000 laborers upon the capital, and the sky over Paris turned completely black. Part 4. When the sky turned black. The legendary City of Light vanished completely under an engine of dust that choked the capital for a decade. Over 100,000 laborers descended upon the city like a coordinated mechanical plague. They didn't have bulldozers. They didn't have diesel excavators or modern wrecking balls. This apocalyptic erasure was executed entirely by human muscle, iron sledgehammers, and thousands of exhausted draft horses. But the true terror of this endeavor wasn't in the loud, deafening crashes of falling masonry. The real psychological weight was found in the eerie, profound silence of the aftermath. Imagine walking down a partially demolished street. You look up and see a centuries-old apartment building violently sliced precisely in half. The exterior walls are gone, exposing intimate faded floral wallpaper directly to the cold rain. A wooden rocking horse sits perfectly still on a fractured mantelpiece, dangerously teetering on the edge of a sheer drop into the abyss. There are no dramatic explosions. There is only the quiet, heavy realization of thousands of sudden, forced departures. The scale of this operation is almost impossible to comprehend today. Over 20,000 residential buildings were systematically dismantled piece by piece. But that creates an entirely new, terrifying logistical nightmare. Where exactly do you put millions of tons of shattered medieval stone? It had to be hauled away in wooden carts, creating an endless, grinding procession that essentially paralyzed the remaining functional streets. The sky turned an unnatural, bruised gray. The air itself became thick, gritty, and terribly difficult to breathe. The sheer volume of destruction was so catastrophic that simply carting away the dead stone became a more complex engineering puzzle than constructing the new city itself. The endless convoys of debris seemed to stretch into eternity, turning every Parisian into an unwilling witness to the grinding gears of the empire. Every single day, the geography of their daily lives was rewritten. A familiar bakery was there on Monday, and by Thursday, it was an empty, jagged crater. The disorientation was total, leaving the population floating in a bizarre state of suspended reality. Yet, while thousands of peripheral neighborhoods crumbled into gravel, the most devastating surgical blow was aimed directly at the ancient, beating heart of the empire. Part 5. The Great Memory Wipe. They didn't just demolish houses, they performed a deliberate, systemic memory wipe on the Ile de la Cité. The Ile de la Cité was the ancient, pulsing, chaotic island center of Paris, the place where the city was first born centuries ago. Within months, it was ruthlessly scraped almost completely bare. This was not a renovation. It was a profound geographical amnesia. The working-class communities that had lived there for generations were abruptly scattered to the wind. Imagine experiencing a sudden, intense phantom limb syndrome, but for an entire city. Displaced citizens would instinctively wander back toward the center on Sundays, hoping to walk down the alleys of their youth, only to find wide, empty macadam squares and imposing government monuments. The cobblestone corner where they had their first kiss was gone. The small, crowded tavern where their grandfather worked was completely erased. They were experiencing the profound, agonizing disorientation of becoming total exiles without ever crossing a national border. Because they could no longer afford the exorbitant, newly inflated rents of Haussmann's gleaming modern center, the working poor were forcefully pushed to the extreme outer edges of the capital. This silent migration gave birth to the modern banlieues, the sprawling, neglected suburbs that still ring the city today. The empire essentially walled off its own luxury core, legally and financially banning the very people whose labor had built it. This wasn't merely aggressive gentrification. It was an act of psychological warfare that turned native citizens into wandering strangers in their own hometown. This brings up a fascinating psychological question. If your childhood neighborhood was entirely erased, does it change who you are? Tell me if your childhood home still exists, or if it's been lost to progress. The loss of physical space inevitably leads to the loss of cultural identity. The rich, tangled folklore of the old Parisian streets was abruptly replaced by the cold, uniform dictates of state-sponsored architecture. The working class wasn't just losing their roofs, they were losing their shared history, their tight-knit community bonds, and their rightful place in the capital's narrative. And as the poorest citizens were permanently exiled into the shadows of the suburbs, a completely different, terrifying world was being violently carved into the earth directly beneath their feet. Part 6. Tunneling through the Empire of Bones. While identical limestone palaces rose toward the sun, a sprawling Gothic nightmare was being excavated in the dark. You cannot build a pristine, sanitized city on the surface without creating a massive, unseen underworld to handle its darkest, dirtiest secrets. Enter Eugene Belgrand, the brilliant and obsessive hydrological engineer tasked with solving Paris's lethal sanitation crisis. His mission was to build the monumental Parisian sewer system. But this was not just digging utility trenches. This was a deep, subterranean excavation directly into the forgotten, haunted history of France. Down in the suffocating darkness, thousands of laborers worked by the flickering light of oil lamps, swinging pickaxes into the damp earth. Almost immediately, they hit the horrifying remnants of the past. The workers constantly unearthed ancient, forgotten plague pits. They breached hidden, crumbling catacombs stacked high with the brittle bones of anonymous ancestors. It was an eerie, Gothic horror playing out entirely out of sight from the wealthy aristocrats sipping champagne in the new cafes above. These laborers literally had to tunnel through unmapped cemeteries to lay their massive vaulted iron pipes. The air down there was thick, toxic, and dripping with the cold sweat of a city trying to outrun its own mortality. The sheer scale was mind-bending. Hundreds of miles of underground galleries wide enough to navigate by boat. This subterranean metropolis was an absolute marvel of hydrological engineering. But to the men choking on the dust below, it felt like digging directly through the gates of underworld. Every brick laid in that echoing, cavernous darkness was a testament to the absolute dualism of Haussmann's vision. The beautiful, fragrant city above was entirely dependent on this grim, terrifying intestinal tract below. Without it, the new boulevards would have drowned in the same disease that plagued the medieval slums. Yet, maintaining this feverish pace of dual construction required an astronomical amount of capital. Laborers demanded daily wages, iron mills required heavy payment, and the sheer momentum of moving mountains of earth consumed cash faster than the empire could physically print it. This dual reality, heaven above and underworld below, was moving at an unstoppable, frantic pace until the entire imperial machine suddenly and disastrously ran out of money. Part 7. The billion-franc heist. The greatest urban transformation in human history was essentially funded by a massive illegal house of cards. Rebuilding a global capital from scratch is not just an architectural challenge, it is a terrifying financial black hole. The sheer volume of cash required to demolish 20,000 buildings, compensate hundreds of thousands of angry property owners, and construct a massive subterranean sewer system was utterly staggering. The official imperial budget was completely drained in a matter of months. But Haussmann was not a man who accepted the word no. When the government treasury ran dry, he turned to the dark arts of high stakes, unregulated finance. He began issuing bons de délégation, which were essentially shadowy proxy bonds. This changes everything. He wasn't just borrowing money, he was borrowing against the future theoretical value of the land he hadn't even finished destroying yet. It was a spectacular, breathtakingly reckless gamble. Imagine the intense, suffocating panic that began to ripple through the city. 100,000 exhausted laborers were swinging pickaxes every single day. If the cash flow stopped for even 1 week, the entire machine would violently seize up. The city would be abandoned as a ruined, half-demolished wasteland, and hundreds of thousands of desperate, starving workers would be left stranded in the rubble. That is why Haussmann kept spinning the plates faster and faster, hiding a jaw-dropping debt of 2.5 billion francs. But the illusion couldn't last forever. A sharp, cynical politician named Jules Ferry finally cracked the books. He published a scathing, explosive pamphlet titled The Fantastic Accounts of Haussmann, exposing the entire financial shell game to the public. The outrage was immediate and absolutely deafening. Haussmann wasn't just a brutal urban planner. He was orchestrating one of the most dangerous and reckless financial heists the 19th century had ever witnessed. The walls were rapidly closing in on the so-called Attila of the Straight Line. The emperor, desperate to save his own political skin as public anger reached a boiling point, had no choice but to sever ties with his most effective, ruthless weapon. Haussmann was unceremoniously fired. The man who had single-handedly redrawn the map of the world's most famous city was discarded like a broken tool. Caught in his own web of colossal debt, the architect was fired and banished, leaving behind a pristine, mathematically perfect city that was about to face its ultimate catastrophic test. Part 8. The Architecture of Exclusion. When the scaffolding finally fell, Paris didn't look like a city. It looked like a mass-produced luxury fortress. The choking clouds of dust finally settled, revealing a landscape that absolutely shocked the 19th century world. The chaotic, organic, wildly unpredictable alleys of the Middle Ages were gone. In their place stood the invention of the modern cityscape, the iconic Haussmann building. But these were not individual works of art. They were the result of a terrifyingly strict, unyielding architectural code enforced directly by the state. Every single detail was mathematically mandated. The zinc roofs had to slope at exactly 45 degrees. The continuous iron balconies on the second floor had to align perfectly with the neighboring buildings, creating an unbroken, razor-sharp horizontal line that stretched for miles. To a modern tourist, it looks incredibly elegant and romantic. But to the working-class citizens of 1870, this endless copy-paste sea of cream-colored limestone felt alien, cold, and profoundly exclusionary. This was the birth of the modern luxury fortress. The social structure of the city was literally baked into the architecture. The wealthy aristocrats occupied the sprawling, high-ceilinged apartments on the Piano Nobile, the second floor, safely elevated above the noise and the mud. Meanwhile, the poorest servants were shoved into the cramped, freezing, airless garret rooms tucked directly beneath those mandatory zinc roofs. The beautiful facades were essentially towering walls of wealth, permanently locking out the very laborers who had swung the pickaxes to build them. The vibrant, messy soul of the capital had been surgically extracted. The chaotic, vibrant soul of medieval Paris was completely gone, replaced by a mathematically sterile beauty that invented the very concept of modern gentrification. You can still feel this exact same aesthetic tension today when you walk down the Champs-Élysées. It is a monument to absolute centralized control. Every tree, every street lamp, every stone was placed there to communicate pure dominance. The emperor looked out from his palace and saw an invincible, perfectly orchestrated machine of stone and iron. He believed he had permanently cured his capital of the disease of rebellion. Napoleon III had successfully built his invincible, beautifully riot-proof capital, but he made one fatal miscalculation about the very people he had exiled. Part 9. The Ultimate Backfire. In 1871, the perfect anti-revolutionary city was set on fire by its own citizens. The ultimate devastating irony of Haussmann's grand design is how spectacularly it failed its primary objective. Napoleon III plunged France into a disastrous, ill-advised war with Prussia. The emperor was swiftly captured, his government collapsed, and a terrifying power vacuum opened up in the capital. The poor, the furious, and the disenfranchised, the very people who had been ruthlessly exiled to the outer suburbs, suddenly flooded back into the pristine, empty center. They seized control. This was the dawn of the Paris Commune. And immediately, the flawless architectural machine turned against its creators. Haussmann had built wide, straight boulevards specifically to prevent the citizens from building barricades. But there is a massive, deadly catch to that geometry. Those same straight lines gave the advancing French military an unobstructed, perfectly clear line of sight to unleash heavy artillery fire directly into their own capital. The city became a brutal, spectacular theater of war. The visual contrast was absolutely horrifying. Imagine the pristine, cream-colored limestone of those luxury fortresses suddenly being shattered by explosive shells, their elegant facades quickly blackened by the thick soot of burning palaces. The revolutionaries, realizing they were outgunned and surrounded, decided that if they could not have the city, no one would. They systematically set the grandest symbols of the empire ablaze: the Tuileries Palace, the Hôtel de Ville, the monumental government archives, all engulfed in towering infernos that lit up the night sky for miles. The wide, straight lines designed to suppress the people became the exact highways that carried their vengeance right back to the palace doors. The anti-barricade design didn't stop the destruction. It merely optimized it. Tens of thousands of Parisians died in the streets during the Bloody Week, their heavy price paid in the streets on the seamless, riot-proof macadam pavement Haussmann had so carefully engineered. The pristine boulevards functioned perfectly as killing fields. It was an apocalyptic, violent end to a profoundly arrogant dream of absolute control. The empire crumbled into ashes, but Haussmann's concrete ghost survived the flames, leaving behind a legacy that still quietly manipulates our minds today. Part 10. The crime scene. We call romantic. Every romantic movie you've ever seen set in Paris is unknowingly celebrating a ruthless, authoritarian gentrification project. This is the ultimate uncomfortable paradox we must confront when we look at the modern world. Georges-Eugène Haussmann essentially invented modern urban planning. Global superpowers looked at his brutal, efficient methods and immediately began copying his playbook. From the aggressive highway expansions in mid-century America to the massive, rapid displacement projects in modern megacities across the globe, the DNA of that ruthless Parisian blueprint is everywhere. Planners realized that if you have enough power, you can simply erase the inconvenient past. But there is a heavy, lingering cost to that kind of erasure. The physical buildings were utterly destroyed, yet the ghosts of the medieval city still silently haunt the modern grid. Underneath the smooth asphalt of those famous, sweeping avenues lie the crushed, forgotten foundations of thousands of generational homes. Below the perfectly manicured parks lie the silenced voices of the working class who were systematically scrubbed from the picture to make the capital look expensive and orderly. We travel from all over the globe to stand on those bridges and take photographs, completely mesmerized by the aesthetic perfection. We admire the uniform balconies, the grand perspectives, the stunning geometry of power. We look at the City of Light and see an unparalleled masterpiece of art, completely blind to the fact that it is, historically, a beautifully paved crime scene. This changes everything about how we experience the spaces we inhabit. It forces us to acknowledge that every grand act of creation requires a devastating act of destruction. The beauty we idolize was bought and paid for with forced exile, psychological terror, and the systematic wiping of a 1,000-year-old memory. History is not just what is built, It is what is deliberately covered up, paved over, and forgotten by the victors who draw the new maps. So the next time you look at a photograph of those perfect Parisian streets, ask yourself, what was permanently erased from the earth just to build the room you are sitting in right now?